In 1776, Adam Smith described a puzzle. Water is cheaper than diamonds. Does this mean water has lower economic value than diamonds? Economists call this puzzle the diamond-water paradox, or the paradox of value. Modern Americans have come up with a remix of this old puzzle. Teachers are paid less than pro athletes. Does this mean teachers have lower economic value than pro athletes? In economics, there is an old joke. Teach a parrot to say supply and demand, and you've got an economist. To the parrot, the explanation of the puzzle is simple. For water, demand is great, but supply is even greater. And so water is relatively abundant, which explains why it's so cheap. For diamonds, demand is small, but supply is even smaller, and so diamonds are relatively scarce, which explains why they are so expensive. But this explanation is incomplete. It only explains why water is cheap and diamonds are expensive. At the heart of the puzzle remains an unsolved mystery. What exactly is the relationship between economic value and price? Water has high economic value but a low price. Diamonds have low economic value but a high price. So are economic value and price inversely related? Obviously not. But if not, what exactly is the relationship between economic value and price? First of all, what is economic value? The economic value of an object is whatever the consumer is willing to pay for it. Economic value is subjective, meaning it depends on the context and the person. On a hot day, Anne is willing to pay as much as $3 for an ice cream. But on a cold day, Anne is willing to pay only $2. In other words, for Anne, an ice cream has a value of $3 on a hot day, but only $2 on a cold day. The value of an ice cream depends on the context, in this case, the weather. Value also depends on the person. On a hot day, an ice cream has a value of $3 to Anne, but only $1 to Bob. In other words, Anne is willing to pay $3 for the ice cream, but Bob is willing to pay only $1. Who's correct? What's the true objective value of an ice cream on a hot day? Is it $3, in which case Anne is correct and Bob is wrong? Or maybe it's $1, in which case Bob is correct and Anne is wrong? Nope. Value is subjective. As economists say, there is no arguing over tastes and colors. If Anne prefers red to blue and Bob blue to red, both are correct. Likewise, if Anne says an ice cream is worth $3, while Bob says it's worth only $1, both are also correct. Next, we should carefully distinguish between four specific measures of economic value: initial value, marginal value, total value, and average value. To illustrate, say it's lunchtime and Chris is starving. She values the very first apple at $9. In other words, she is willing to pay as much as $9 for the first apple. Having eaten the first apple, she is no longer starving, and so she values the second apple at only $5. After the second apple, she is even less hungry, and so she values the third apple at only $4. After the third apple, she is mostly full, and so she values the fourth apple at only $1. Suppose the price of an apple is $2. Then Chris is happy to buy the first 3 apples because their values exceed $2, but she will not buy the fourth because its value is less than $2. Altogether, then, Chris buys exactly 3 apples. Initial value refers to the value of the very first unit of a good purchased. So for Chris, the apples have an initial value of $9. Marginal value refers to the value of the very last unit purchased. So for Chris, the apples have a marginal value of $4. Again, initial value refers to the first unit purchased, while marginal value refers to the last unit purchased. Total value is simply 9 plus 5 plus $4, or $18. Average value is simply total value divided by the number of units consumed. That's $6. When people say that water is obviously more valuable than diamonds, they are probably thinking of initial and total value. Ordinarily, 1 kilogram of water is much cheaper than 1 kg of diamonds. But in a world without water and diamonds, 1 kg of water could extend a person's life by a few days, while 1 kg of diamonds would do diddly squat. And so, we'd certainly pay more for that very first kg of water than for that very first kg of diamonds. In other words, water has higher initial value than diamonds. Water also certainly has higher total value than diamonds. In a world without water and diamonds, we'd rather recover all our water than recover all our diamonds. Altogether then, water has higher initial and total value than diamonds. So why then is water cheaper than diamonds? The answer is that, surprisingly enough, price does not depend on initial or total value. Instead, price depends on marginal value, the value of the very last unit purchased. As the great economist Paul Samuelson put it, the theory of economic value is easy to understand if you just remember that in economics the tail wags the dog. Price depends on a seemingly unimportant factor, namely marginal value. The paradox of value vanishes once we carefully distinguish between the 4 measures of value and understand that, surprisingly enough, price does not depend on the initial, total, or average value. Instead, price depends on marginal value. Water has immense initial and total value, but it has a low price because it has low marginal value. There is so much water that the very last unit of water has little value. Diamonds have much lower initial and total value than water, but they fetch a high price because their marginal value is high. There are so few diamonds that even the very last unit of diamonds has great value. The question of value confused even some of history's greatest thinkers, and so it is not surprising that even today it continues to confuse and confound. Now, no drop of water ever complained about being paid too little, nor has anyone ever been morally outraged by the low price of water. The same cannot be said of teachers. Which is why the modern American version of the puzzle is not just confusing, it's controversial. When people say that teachers are more valuable than pro athletes, they are probably thinking of initial, total, and average value. The US has about 4 million teachers and 12,000 athletes. Imagine an alien kidnaps all of them. Recovering one teacher could help preserve and transmit some human knowledge. In contrast, recovering one athlete would do diddly squat. And so the very first teacher is more valuable than the very first athlete. In other words, teachers have higher initial value than athletes. Teachers also certainly have higher total value. We'd pay more to recover all 4 million teachers than to recover all 12,000 athletes. Indeed, it is quite plausible that we'd pay over 400 times as much to recover the teachers, which would mean that teachers have a total value that is over 400 times that of athletes. If so, teachers would also have higher average value. This is because average value is total value divided by the number of teachers or athletes, and there are only about 350 times as many teachers as there are athletes. Altogether then, teachers have higher initial, total, and possibly average value. But once again, it is the tail that wags the dog. Price does not depend on any of these measures of value. Instead, price depends on marginal value. If the alien kidnapped only one teacher and one athlete, we'd probably prefer to recover the athlete than to recover the teacher. This shows that we value the very last athlete over the very last teacher. In other words, athletes have higher marginal value. This, however, says nothing whatsoever about initial, total, or average value. Teachers may be paid less than athletes, but this tells us no more about the downfall of civilization than the fact that water is cheaper than diamonds. It is perfectly possible that society places greater initial, total, and average value on teachers, and yet still pays teachers less, simply because teachers have lower marginal value. Now, isn't there something terribly unfair, unjust, and immoral about this? Maybe, but consider this. A world in which water and teachers were paid more than diamonds and athletes would also be a world where instead of water and teachers being relatively abundant, they were relatively scarce. Such a world might be bursting with fairness, justice, and morality, but it would also be filled with misery. The low marginal value of teachers and water is a blessing rather than a curse. We are blessed with so many teachers and so much water that the very last teacher and the very last unit of water are simply not very valuable. So just remember, in economics, the tail wags the dog. Price depends on marginal value, the value of the very last unit purchased. In this video, our goal was to make a simple and purely theoretical point about price and value, and so we didn't bother looking at any empirical data. But if we did, here are 3 quick findings we'd make. First, in the US, the median annual wage for teachers is about $54K. In contrast, for athletes, it is only about $45K. What? If this seems unbelievably low, that's because we only ever talk about the top athletes in the top sports leagues. A LeBron James in the NBA may be paid over $30 million a year. But over in the NBA Development League, players get either $19,500 or $26,000 a year, and this is after the most recent pay increase. Lol. Second, most parts of the US still have the so-called tenure system, under which teachers enjoy lifelong employment. In contrast, pro athletes enjoy no such protection. Indeed, athletes usually have very short careers in the top sports leagues. So even if some do make big bucks, they often only do so for a few years. Third, the 4 major U.S. sports leagues have combined annual revenues of around $32 billion. Sounds like a lot, but compare this to U.S. spending on educational institutions, which comes to about $1 trillion a year. Simply based on these 3 quick findings, it would hardly appear that Americans value sports over education.
Econ Cow is a new channel for educational videos, mostly on economics. I'm still trying to improve, so please feel free to leave me any feedback in the comments below. And of course, subscribe, and watch another video.